I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me, in the beginning, Mr. President, to congratulate you for assuming presidency of the Security Council for this month. I also congratulate you on your success in leading the deliberations of the Council. Mr. President, by just listening to some of the briefings from some of our colleagues just now, by just comparing these briefings or these statements, such a comparison indicates that some know what they're talking about and what's happening in Syria by virtue of being on the ground and their political involvement in following the developments and the situation in Syria, while some others who have spoken are not on the ground and do not know what's happening in Syria, and are primarily basing their statements on media fabrications and intelligence information that present an image that what's happening in Syria is not related to counterterrorism and that there's a humanitarian crisis caused solely by the Syrian government. This comparison is very important as I begin to speak, so that some colleagues become aware that 7 years into the terrorist war imposed against my country, it is now time to seize all one-upmanship and all delusive tactics. Mr. President, I have very carefully listened to the briefing by the new Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Mark Lowcock, and I wish him all the success in implementing his noble mission as the head of OCHA. I assure him here that we are most ready to cooperate with any sincere effort to address the humanitarian situation in my country, so long as the purpose is assisting the Syrian people without seeking to exploit the Syrian people's pain for interventionist agendas. The Syrian government, since the beginning of the terrorist war against my country, has continued to cooperate with the United Nations and its different agencies to deliver humanitarian assistance to the people who need them, based on the governing principles of humanitarian work, particularly General Assembly Resolution 182/46, at the head of which is the respect for Syrian sovereignty, which has been upheld by all Security Council resolutions on Syria. The issue of sovereignty is extremely important, dear colleagues, because some forget when they speak the issue of sovereignty. And in all friendliness and love, I tell our colleague, Mr. Mark Lowcock, that he has committed this mistake today when, in his statement, he has not mentioned at all cooperation with the Syrian government, as if the OCHA is cooperating with ghosts in Syria and not a government. Mr. President, we believe it is now time, after the Secretary General Report number 43 on the humanitarian situation in Syria, to move from a state of denial to recognition that the root cause of this crisis in my country is the emergence and proliferation of armed terrorist groups, at the forefront of which is Daesh and al-Nusra and their affiliated groups. And the summoning of tens of thousands of foreign terrorist fighters and their spread in all neighborhoods and villages and taking civilians there as humanitarian shields and promoting barbarian ideologies. This has been affirmed by the report of the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team established pursuant to Resolution 1526, and that has been issued as document S/2015/358. Also, some states have imposed, in blatant violation of international law, unilateral, arbitrary economic measures against the Syrian people, which has led to hardship of life and exacerbation of their suffering in all areas: economic, social, humanitarian, and health related. My colleague, the ambassador of the United States, has just said that her government has allocated $160 million to spend on Syrian refugees in neighboring countries. Would it not have been better that these amounts be used to return the refugees to their home nation, Syria, to rebuild schools and hospitals and roads, instead of pressing to keep them outside Syrian territory? Mr. President, we have met a few days ago with Mr. Lowcock, and we conveyed to him very clearly the concerns of the Syrian government and its observations on the performance of OCHA during the recent period, based on our hopes to build a transparent and professional relationship and objective relationship that leads to achieving our objectives and your objectives, which are to assist the Syrian people in fulfilling their needs and to provide assistance to everyone who needs it, and to rehabilitate infrastructure so that refugees and displaced persons can return to their homes after stability is restored by the efforts of Syria and allied countries. The relationship that we hope to achieve with the United Nations and its humanitarian agencies are: one, this relationship is first a legal relationship that respects the governing principles of humanitarian work. Second, it's an ethical relationship based on the non-politicization of the humanitarian situation and not to exploit it as a means to exert pressure on the Syrian government. Third, a relationship of partnership and cooperation where we recognize the efforts of the Syrian government to deliver assistance and the barriers that obstruct the delivery of assistance. A realistic relationship that recognizes that the real reason behind Syrian suffering is international terrorism, in addition to the unilateral, arbitrary economic measures imposed by the United States and the European Union and other countries against the Syrian people. Fifth, a credible relationship that recognizes that illegal actions of the international coalition are increasing the suffering of Syrians through killing thousands of civilians and destroying infrastructure. A credible relationship that recognizes that suspicious sources cannot be relied upon, or sources related to terrorist organizations, in assessing the situation in Syria. Fifth, a relationship that rejects treating Syrian pain as a commodity, that recognizes that donor conferences are just for show, and that refuse the exploitation of donor countries this humanitarian situation. The proportion of delivering assistance pledges has not increased to over 33%. A relationship that also denounces the connection of political work with the financing of the humanitarian response. Mr. President, American aircrafts have struck a school for disabled students, and I suddenly now find accusation against Syrian Air Force that we have attacked the school in the same area. This relationship I am speaking of, Mr. President, must not only aim to lift the suffering, or it must be based on trust and partnership and cooperation and dialogue and professionalism and credibility, and not on the basis of imposing conditions that violate Syrian sovereignty. Mr. President, the Syrian government has not spared effort since the beginning of what we call the crisis to be involved in any sincere effort to improve access of humanitarian assistance. By example, my country has recently accepted and approved the resident coordinator's proposal to establish a mechanism that includes the Syrian government and the Russian Federation and the United Nations to promote coordination between the active parties in the humanitarian scene in Syria as part of the humanitarian response plan as per the joint convoys plan, and also to review and implement measures to deliver assistance to the de-escalated zones. And this mechanism has held its first meeting in Damascus on the 19th of September. The Syrian government stresses the importance that humanitarian assistance not be limited to de-escalated zone, to destabilized zones. They must also reach areas liberated by the Syrian Arab Army and its allied forces, particularly in Deir ez-Zor and eastern Aleppo and other places. We appreciate here very much the important assistance provided by the government of the Russian Federation and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Some want to fight Iran in Syria and to fight our allied forces allied to us in Syria. This is defaming, and it violates international law and the UN Charter. Mr. President, I've also listened to the briefing by the Special Envoy, Mr. Staffan de Mistura, and I would like to say here that the Deputy Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister has affirmed days ago before the General Assembly that the policy of the Syrian state has been based since the beginning of the terrorist war against us on two pillars. They are counterterrorism and working diligently and consistently to achieve a political solution that ends the bloodshed and restores stability, and to continue the national reconciliations that have proven successful and that have allowed thousands of displaced persons and refugees to return to their homes, and that have contributed largely to improving the living conditions of large numbers of Syrians who have suffered too much from terrorist crimes. The Syrian government has demonstrated seriousness and commitment to the two processes of Astana and Geneva, and we have attended 7 rounds in Astana and 7 in Geneva. And some still say that the Syrian government is not serious about the political process. So what have we been doing for 7 rounds in Astana and 7 rounds in Geneva? My country views positively the Astana process and the resulting identification of de-escalated zones, hoping that we will reach a real end of all fighting and separate the terrorist organizations such as Daesh and Nusra and others from the other groups that have agreed to join the Astana process. What is wrong about this, I say here? What is wrong? Isn't this compatible with the Security Council resolutions? In the same vein, my government renews its commitment to the Geneva process and seeks to advance it. And the Syrian delegation has joined all rounds of the Geneva negotiations seriously and responsibly. And lately, we have had a very useful round with the special envoy and his team, where we have focused on two topics: combating terrorism and meetings of the experts of constitutional law. In conclusion, Mr. President, my government reiterates it will continue to combat international terrorism on all the territory of the Syrian Arab Republic. I repeat, all the territory of the Syrian Arab Republic. And we stress our fixed position that the solution to this crisis in Syria is a political solution, inter-Syrian, based on inter-Syrian dialogue with Syrian leadership, without external intervention and without conditions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Syrian Arab Republic for his statement.